In the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa became the president of the Teamsters. He was a very influential figure in the American labor industry. Workers across the nation respected him for his devotion to the organization. However, what a lot of people didn't know at the time was that Jimmy Hoffa was deeply connected to the mob. This once influential leader was sentenced to prison in 1967 for bribery. Richard Nixon later commuted his sentence in 1971. But even though Jimmy was free, things weren't the same as before. He was no longer a leader with Teamsters, and it was believed that his relationship with the Mafia was rocky. Jimmy Hoffa disappeared on July 30, 1975. He was last seen in the parking lot at Mac's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit. It's believed that he was there to meet with key figures in the mob, but very little is known about the events leading up to his disappearance and what happened to him that day. Since his disappearance, many theories have come forward, from being shot by Frank Sheeran in a Bloomfield house to being buried in a drum under the Giants Stadium in New Jersey. Plenty of Mafia figures have even claimed to be part of his disappearance. Sadly, this mystery has never been solved, but investigators couldn't ignore all of the stories that were coming to light. Many of the locations have been investigated, only to turn up empty. In today's video, we're going to discuss 9 places where investigators have searched for Jimmy Hoffa. Number 1. Gardina, California. When Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, the initial investigation took place in Michigan. However, an early theory came out that pointed investigators toward California. Could Jimmy have been taken to a different state? Around the time of his disappearance, rumors were going around that he was involved in a business deal with a man from Gardina, California. There was reason to believe that this deal went sour, but what could have happened? When this rumor was making rounds, people were under the impression that the businessman from Gardina had Jimmy killed. They believed Jimmy's body was buried underneath the foundation of a local restaurant and poker club. Even though there was no weight to this theory, it fascinated a lot of people, especially those who were familiar with the area. However, this theory did eventually get put to rest. Larry Flint, a magazine publisher, ended up purchasing the property. The property was fully excavated as the new owner had plans to turn it into a casino. While the area was searched, Jimmy Hoffa's body wasn't discovered. Number 2. Hampton, Michigan. Since Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, many people have claimed to know what really happened to him. Some have even claimed to be the ones that made him disappear. After all, when a criminal can take credit for such a notorious crime, it adds to their Mafia legacy. Over the decades, many tips have come forward on Jimmy Hoffa. One came forward that investigators believed to be credible. This tip came from prison inmate Richard Powell. Now, why did authorities have reason to believe this imprisoned criminal? Richard Powell had been behind bars since 1982 after killing his landlady. He previously provided investigators information that helped them discover the body of a man who had been missing since the 1970s. They discovered the body buried underneath the crawl space of the house Richard had been living in. Several months after this body was discovered, Richard provided alleged information about Jimmy Hoffa. He claimed that Jimmy Hoffa was injected with pharmaceutical materials. The materials and syringe were in a briefcase buried in the backyard of that property. Since Richard's previous tip turned out to be true, authorities believed it was in their best interest to investigate the Jimmy Hoffa claim. This launched the 2003 Hampton, Michigan investigation. There was a pool assembled in the backyard on the property. Investigators dug up the pool as they searched for evidence. However, no evidence was discovered. While Richard Powell was able to provide authorities with one solid tip, his history of telling made-up stories is much longer. Allegedly, this inmate had failed multiple polygraph tests, so it's not surprising that he would try to take credit for a crime he didn't commit. Number 3. Bloomfield, Michigan. The Bloomfield theory sparked more than just an investigation. This theory was also the focus of the book I Heard You Paint Houses and the Netflix movie The Irishman. Frank Sheeran was a truck driver who became a hitman for the mob. He's also the one who brought this theory to light when he made claims that he was the one who killed the former Teamster president. Before they became enemies, they were allies. The two were introduced through Russell Buffalino, aka the Quiet Don. Over the years, Frank Sheeran allegedly killed many people for Jimmy Hoffa. They had a rather good relationship that never actually went downhill. So why would Frank Sheeran kill someone he considered an ally? Jimmy Hoffa spent time in prison for bribery. When he was released, he was no longer allowed to run the Teamsters. However, he was still desperate to get his role back. Allegedly, Jimmy Hoffa made too many threats to the wrong people. When he started making threats towards the Mafia, things turned ugly. Russell Buffalino ordered a hit on the former Teamsters president and trusted Frank Sheeran to pull it off. According to Frank, he brought Jimmy to a house in Bloomfield. While he had a job to do, he didn't want his friend to suffer. Frank claims to have shot Jimmy Hoffa in the back of the head. His body was later burned so it wouldn't be discovered. This tip may have been good enough to land a book deal and a movie, but was it good enough to uncover actual evidence? In 2004, the house was investigated. During this investigation, they did discover blood. However, it turns out that it wasn't Jimmy Hoffa's blood. Number 4. Milford, Michigan. Another suspect in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance was Roland McMaster. Unlike other suspects we are covering today, Roland was never the one claiming he made Jimmy disappear, but at the time of the disappearance, he did have a vendetta against the former Teamsters president. Roland McMaster was also a Teamster. Similar to Hoffa, he had a reputation for being involved in some shady business. This included racketeering and using forceful tactics. When Jimmy Hoffa was sentenced to prison, Roland Mace knew that he was interested in taking over the presidency, but Jimmy had already appointed Frank Fitzsimmons the role, allegedly allowing him to remain in control from prison. Although this worked for them while Jimmy was in prison, things changed when he was on the outside. As Jimmy struggled to regain his power, Roland seized the opportunity to take control. However, he didn't stand a chance against Jimmy's influence. In order to take over, he formed a crew to work against his rival. Allegedly, they participated in violent shakedowns. The crew was formed in 1974, the year before Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. While Roland McMaster remained a suspect for many decades, he didn't become the subject of an investigation until 2006. This came after a tip from a prison inmate, Donovan Wells. Donovan was a former business partner of Roland McMaster. He also lived on Roland's farm the summer that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. Following this lead, the FBI launched an investigation on the farm. This investigation cost $250,000 and took 2 weeks to perform. During this search, they didn't discover a body, but they do have reason to believe that the body could have been buried on this farm at one point and moved elsewhere. Number 5. Roseville, Michigan. Another rumor that was going around at the time of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance brought investigators to a home on Florida Street in Roseville, Michigan. Allegedly, the homeowner in 1975 was a bookie for Anthony Giacalone, a known gangster in Detroit. Now, Russell Buffalino wasn't the only Mafia figure that was being threatened by Jimmy Hoffa. The former Teamsters president was believed to be cooperating with authorities to crack down on organized crime. Several Mafia figures who once supported Jimmy were now looking at him as the enemy. Anthony Giacalone was one of them. But how did this gangster get tied to the disappearance? An anonymous tip was provided about the night of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. Allegedly, the bookie who owned the home at the time was up late at night pouring concrete that very same night. Over the years, the FBI brushed off this tip. After all, tips were coming in left, right, and center. Many of them were unreliable. However, after several decades, they decided to look into this possible theory. In 2012, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality scanned the property and detected an anomaly in the soil. This launched a further investigation, during which they drilled holes in the driveway to search for human remains. During this search, there was no discovery of human remains. It was another dead end in the search for what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Number 6. Giant Stadium. Out of all the theories that surround Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the story about the Giant Stadium is the most popular. The story goes that Jimmy was killed and stuffed in a drum. That drum was buried under the Giant Stadium. This story was first brought to the public's attention in the 1980s when Donald Francos, aka Tony the Greek, made claims that he had information on the group hired to get rid of Jimmy Hoffa. The public was torn on this tip. Some people believed him. The Giant Stadium was under construction at the time. If planned right, the Mafia would have been able to bury him before the foundation was put down. However, many people were skeptical about this tip, including authorities and Jimmy's family. At that point in time, many places in Michigan were suitable for burying a body. The tip provided didn't make sense as far as why. Why would the group hired to kill him take his body to another state? Over the decades, people continued to debate this theory, but authorities were finally able to put it to rest in 2010. The Giant Stadium was demolished as the city was preparing to build a new sports complex. The FBI took advantage of the opening and searched the area for the infamous drum containing Jimmy Hoffa's dismembered body. This search only proved that Tony the Greek wasn't a reliable source. He initially provided the information as part of an interview for Playboy magazine. It's more likely he was trying to solidify his legacy as a gangster than actually providing a reliable tip. Number 7. Jersey City, New Jersey. So we can rule out the Giant Stadium theory, but the next story on our list takes us back to New Jersey on the hunt for a drum. This time, they were looking for Jimmy's body in a Jersey City landfill. Now, this tip originally came out early on after the disappearance. An anonymous tipster informed authorities that Jimmy Hoffa's body was in a 55-pound drum buried in the landfill near Hackensack River. There was surveillance of this area performed early on in the investigation, but it was eventually called off. But in 2021, The search for Jimmy Hoffa brought investigators back to this area. The tip came from Frank Capella, the son of Paul Capella Sr., who worked for the landfill. On Frank's deathbed, he spilled a secret that his father had shared with him. Allegedly, Paul had been hired to bury the drum containing Jimmy Hoffa's body. The owner of the landfill, Phil Moscato, chose the spot and got Paul to bury other drums along with it. This deathbed confession gave authorities a reason to check the area. However, in 2022, they announced that they didn't discover anything during this search. Number 8. Florida Everglades. In the 1980s, Mafia hitman Charles Allen made claims that he knew what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. According to this hitman, Anthony Provenzano had ordered the hit against the Teamsters president. Anthony Provenzano was a very powerful figure in the Genovese crime family and involved with the Teamsters in New Jersey. He was also known to be associated with Jimmy Hoffa. Many theories swirling around this infamous theory link back to an order from Anthony, but the Florida Everglades theory is one of the most popular. According to Charles Allen, Jimmy was shot to death. His body was then ground up and placed inside a steel drum. The mobsters then dumped that drum into a swamp filled with alligators. The story of Jimmy Hoffa's ground-up body being fed to alligators has traveled around the world, but no evidence has ever been discovered to add credibility to the story. Charles Allen isn't exactly the most reliable source, as he's known to say just about anything to get a story. Number 9. Japan. The last theory we're going to talk about is one of the most bizarre. The speculation of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa has taken people all over the U.S. While Michigan has always been the main state suspected, other stories have taken us to burial spots in New Jersey, swamps in Florida, and other parts of the states. But the story that his body, or at least part of it, is in Japan is the most shocking. Not only is this story the most surprising, but it's also the most difficult to prove or rule out. So this is another deathbed confession. Allegedly, a hitman used a knife to kill Jimmy Hoffa. His body was then dismembered, burnt, and compressed into steel parts. These steel parts were sent to an auto manufacturing company in Japan. It has been almost 50 years since Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. His disappearance is still one of the biggest mysteries in Mafia history to this day, as he's often referred to as America's most digged-for man. Over the decades, more than 200 FBI agents have been involved in the case. While we may never know what happened to the former Teamsters president, it's something that we'll always be curious about. In today's video, we discussed 9 theories that investigators couldn't ignore. But these are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance stories. Other theories claim that he was buried under a helipad at a Sheraton hotel in Georgia. There's even one where his old driver hinted that he was buried under a General Motors building. Law enforcement has been dedicated to bringing an end to this story, but without any evidence, this case can be next to impossible to solve. Which theory do you think is the most plausible? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you hit like, share, and subscribe for more Mafia Mystique content.